Hello friends and welcome back. We are 1 month out approximately from season 3 of His Dark Materials, and I thought that it was high time that I delivered on my promise to do a recap of season 2. I know that it has been 2 years since the last season premiered, and my mind has gone to other places. I really needed to refresh myself on what happened on the show. I thought that other folks might need to refresh as well. One of the larger threads that we follow through season 2 is this idea of prophecy, and that actually starts in the beginning of the first episode. We see that Lord Asriel has blown apart the sky. There is a huge white beam appearing, and for the witches, this is the indication that a prophecy has begun. And this prophecy states that whatever just happened either foretells the end of existence or the beginning of something anew. Soon after we hear about the prophecy, we see Lyra. I know in my previous videos I have referred to her as Lyra. I've gotten so much hate for that, which I understand, so I have heard the name Lyra pronounced as Lyra enough to submit to the will of everyone else. I will be calling her Lyra from here on out. We see Lyra enter a city that looks very abandoned. It has kind of a Mediterranean feel to it, and we come to learn that it is called Cittàgazze. Back in Lyra's world, the Magisterium higher-ups are all on a boat discussing what to do about the schism, as they call it. We have the Cardinal and we have Father MacPhail going back and forth deciding, can they admit to this? Do they deny it? We also have Mrs. Coulter, who eventually steps in. It's revealed that the Magisterium has captured a witch named Katya, and to kind of go between these two guys, Mrs. Coulter decides that she will interrogate the witch for more information. She does interrogate the witch after taking off her jewelry and begins to torture her. Katya said that there is a prophecy about Lyra, which of course piques Mrs. Coulter's interest. And she does state that Lyra is known by another name, and that is what this prophecy is about. We see the witches meeting together to discuss what their plans will be. They have invited Lee Scoresby, and he makes it clear that his next step is to find Stanislaus Grumman. He's heard that Stanislaus Grumman has some kind of weapon, and he's hoping to find Grumman and then take that to Lyra to protect her. Serafina Pekkala is very much aligned with helping Lyra. Another witch queen, Ruta Skadi, is a little bit less sure. Ruta Skadi flies off to help Katya, who's being tortured by Mrs. Coulter. We see Ruta not only killing Katya to save her from revealing too much, Katya is also ready for death, and on her way out, Ruta makes sure to stab the Cardinal. The Cardinal doesn't die immediately, and Mrs. Coulter and Father MacPhail are left wondering what they should do. Mrs. Coulter, in a master manipulative move, convinces Father MacPhail that maybe the best thing to do is to do nothing at all. This opens up an opportunity for Father MacPhail to seize power, which we see him do later this season. Lyra enters a cafe in Cittàgazze, and it turns out she is not alone. She almost literally collides with Will. The two don't know who the other person are. They're both scrappy kids, so they get into some kind of physical conflict, and once they kind of back off and realize that maybe they don't need to fight, they introduce themselves and realize that, oh wait, Will doesn't have a demon, he's from a different world. Cool. We see them settling into an uneasy alliance, primarily because Will is such a kind person and Pan has the sensibility that Lyra doesn't. They eventually find other kids in Cittàgazze, and the two kids that we see most often are called Angelica and Paola. Angelica and Paola are useful to the kids because they explain that the city is as empty as it is because of the specters of indifference. The specters are these beings that kids can't see until they hit puberty, but they are in extreme danger to adults. They attack adults and consume whatever it is that makes adults human. So that is why the city seems deserted but isn't. That is why there are no adults and there are all of these half-feral kids running free, doing whatever the fuck they want. Will is quite capable of taking care of himself in a way that Lyra is not. We see him making an omelet for both of the kids. She has never seen one, and in one of the best scenes in the season, in my opinion, she eats the omelet with her bare hand. Towards the end of the episode, the kids come to realize that they are from Oxford, but in different universes. This gives Lyra the idea to consult an experimental theologian in Will's world, since she knows that she can't go back to her own. Will, bless his heart, agrees to go with her. And just as the episode is ending, Lyra consults her alethiometer to figure out if Will is a worthy companion. The alethiometer tells her that he is indeed a murderer, but not to worry, he's the good kind, like Yorick Burnison. Episode 2 takes place the following day. We see that Lyra is barreling through the window into Will's Oxford. She promptly gets hit by a car, but is okay. The kids are immediately spotted by Lord Boreal, who is lurking in his Tesla nearby. Back in Lyra's world, we see that Father MacPhail is using the Cardinal's funeral as a means to consolidate and announce his power grab. Mrs. Coulter looks like the most fabulous Italian widow there ever was. And we see Boreal somehow back in his own world, flirting and also scheming with and somehow making veiled threats with Mrs. Coulter. They have a complicated relationship. Later that day, Father MacPhail has started to see some of the prisoners the Magisterium has taken, including Dr. Lancelius, my beloved namesake. He was sent to the Magisterium as an envoy from the witches to broker mutual tolerance. After a totally sham trial, he is sentenced to 8 years of hard labor and separation from his demon. In Will's Oxford, the kids end up splitting up. Lyra goes to the Pitt Rivers Museum, and we see her consulting the alethiometer about what to do, where to go. The alethiometer does tell her about the scholar she should be looking for. Interestingly, the alethiometer also tells that she should focus on helping Will find his dad. She thinks that she can probably do both, but her needs are more important than Will's. It so happens that Lord Boreal is creeping at the museum and happens upon Lyra accidentally. We see Will checking on his mom through the window. He also sends her a text to assure her that he's safe, but he decides not to actually engage with her in person, and he goes on a mad goose chase to find money from his dad's lawyer. It doesn't end well. It's not even worth getting into, to be honest. Lyra eventually finds the experimental theologian or scholar that she's looking for, who is, surprise, a woman. Her name is Dr. Mary Malone, and she works out of the Dark Matter Research Unit. Mary Malone explains that dark matter, also called shadow particles, are attracted to human consciousness. They themselves are conscious, and Mary Malone has discovered that she can connect with the particles. Lyra realizes that shadow particles are the same as dust. Lyra connects to Mary Malone's cave, the computer that she's using to do her research with the shadow particles, and realizes that Mary has some work to do. Lyra promises to come back to the lab the following day and scurries off to meet Will at the botanical garden, though she is definitely running late. With a very strong nudge from Mrs. Coulter, we see Father MacPhail at the very end of the episode go hard against the witches. He orders a cleansing and decides to send airships and take care of them. Definitely some genocidal tones here. In episode 3, we see a shadowy hooded figure doing some shaman-esque stuff. We realize that it's John Perry, and he is using a ring to summon Lee Scoresby. Immediately after he does this, the winds have shifted for Lee, and his balloon is moving towards the town of Yenisei. Lee gets a hot tip at the bar in town that Stanislaus Grimond had some kind of association with the observatory outside of town. So he goes to the observatory to learn more, and unfortunately the scientist who currently works there is not a fan of Grimond. This scientist has a very strong allegiance to the Magisterium and decides that Lee is up to no good. They eventually get in some kind of gunfight, and Lee accidentally shoots the man dead. Not great. He feels a ton of remorse. It was definitely an accident, but oh no! The might and force of the Magisterium are outside waiting for Lee. He is completely surrounded and taken back to jail in the town. Later in the episode is one of my absolute favorite scenes in the show, and probably the best deviation from the book. Mrs. Coulter hears that Lee has been taken into custody, let's say, and she decides to pay him a visit. She knows that he has an association or friendship with Lyra, and she wants more information if she can get it. Lee knows exactly who she is, and a very interesting conversation conversation ensues, Lee basically calls Mrs. Coulter out for being a terrible fucking parent. He tells her about his own childhood that was trauma-riddled, physically abusive, and emotionally horrific, and really sees that Mrs. Coulter probably had a very similar childhood. He tells her that his life is worth a tenth of Lyra's, and for that reason he will never ever reveal her whereabouts or any information he might have about her. Would highly recommend watching episode 3 just for this amazing, really heartbreaking scene. We see this human side of Mrs. Coulter and my cat that we haven't seen before. Mrs. Coulter is very shaken by this episode. She realizes, like, he's not going to tell me anything. So she goes outside to collect herself, and in that moment we see that the golden monkey reaches his little paw to fit into her hand and comfort her. I will definitely be talking about this moment in my next video about the best and weirdest moments of this season, so if you want me blabbering on about that more, please watch that video. My cat knows she's being filmed apparently and has decided to get into no good herself. In a strange twist of her character, or evolution of it at least, Mrs. Coulter actually lets Lee Scoresby out. She tosses him the keys to his shackles, and he is left free and available to leave the jail in Yenisei and head out. Lyra goes back to Will's Oxford to see Mary Malone again, against the better judgment of Pantalaimon and also maybe the alethiometer. When Lyra gets to Mary Malone's office, Mary Malone tells her that a certain detective is looking for her and asking questions. He catches both of them in the elevator, and they go back to Mary's office to chat. D.I. Waters, the mustachioed fella, questions Lyra and eventually traps her into telling him that not only does she know Will, but that they are staying together, and a chase ensues. Lyra runs through the streets of Will's Oxford looking for an escape and finds a very helpful Lord Boreal pulling up in his Tesla. He offers her a ride, she gets in and realizes that maybe this wasn't the best idea. Lord Boreal agrees to let her out, and in her haste to get out of the Tesla, Lyra forgets her backpack. Luckily, Lord Boreal sees the backpack, he gives it back to her through the car, and as he is driving away, Lyra realizes that the alethiometer is missing, and Lord Boreal is a fucking thief. He took the alethiometer. Will realizes that Lyra is missing, and he eventually finds her note saying that she went to meet up with Mary Malone in his world. He goes back to his Oxford and finds Lyra completely upset about losing the alethiometer, and the two of them hatch a plan to get it back. Pan remembers that Charles Leitrim, aka Lord Boreal, gave Lyra his business card, so they have a means to contact him. Lyra and Will do go to Lord Boreal, aka Charles Leitrim's house. He says that he will give Lyra the alethiometer back, but in return, they must get something for him, and what they're looking for is a knife in Cittàgazze. Episode 4 starts with the history of the knife. We learn that the knife was created by a guild of philosophers in Cittàgazze. This knife is special because it can cut the fabric in between worlds, and it is the knife of Cittàgazze that actually introduced specters into the world. Now that he is free, Lee takes a boat up the Yenisei River to continue his search for Stanislaus Grumman. He eventually meets a bird demon, an osprey, who takes him to this kind of shack that we have seen. We finally get to meet Stanislaus Grumman, aka Jopari, aka John Perry, aka Will's dad. Lee and Jopari meet. We realize that Jopari has summoned Lee through that ring that we saw in the previous episode, and he needs to get somewhere. He has a task that he wants to fulfill, and that task is to find the bearer of the knife and make sure that bearer goes to Lord Asriel to help Lord Asriel with his war. Lee is not about this. Lee has his own agenda, and that is around helping Lyra. We also find out that Jopari, I'll call him Jopari because that's what he prefers in this episode, became a shaman to find his way home. It's not that he wanted to abandon his wife and kid. Lee and Jopari eventually make a deal. Lee will take Jopari to the knife bearer if and only if Joffrey can make sure that the knife bearer protects Lyra with the knife. Back in Cittàgazze, we see Will and Lyra finally gain entry into the Tower of the Angels, and there they find a man who is tied up. His name is Giacomo Paradisi. He is the previous knife bearer, and he is being held captive by a boy named Tullio, who we come to find out is related to Angelica and Paola. He is holding the knife. He is definitely of age, so he has the specters to fight off, and sure enough, when Will sees him and he sees Will, they begin to fight over the knife. It is a bloody fight. It involves Will losing 2 of his fingers, which are sliced clean off by this incredible knife. Eventually, Tullio has to concede that Will has him overpowered, and he skulks off into the night. Will is terrified by the knife, doesn't want anything to do with it, but Giacomo Paradisi says losing the 2 fingers is a sign that you are the bearer of the knife. The knife has chosen Will to bear it, and now Will has to learn how the knife works and what the rules are around it. We see Giacomo training Will. He has to put his being into the tip of the knife to feel that fabric between the worlds and make a cut. This is very hard for Will, especially because he is bleeding profusely, but under Giacomo's tutelage and some encouragement from Lyra, he is able to successfully open and close a window. In a particularly hard moment for Will, we see Pan cuddling up next to Will, and Will touches his head very gingerly. This is a super awkward moment for the kids, but Pan really wants to comfort Will, who doesn't have a demon, theoretically. Now that Giacomo has passed on his knowledge of the knife to Will, he sends the kids on their way so he can die in peace. We see him poison himself so that he dies before the specters can reach him. A bit grisly. We also see that the witches have decided to follow Lyra through Asriel's anomaly. Ruta Skadi says that she will head over to Asriel. First, they have to get through the Magisterium. The anomaly is being guarded by Magisterium airships at the moment. Lord Boreal sends Mrs. Coulter a message saying that he knows where Lyra is, and he essentially takes Mrs. Coulter through Cittàgazze into Will's Oxford in an effort to reunite mother and child. Mary Malone has gotten the cave working in the way that Lyra had suggested. She discovers that the dark matter that she has been researching is not only conscious but has a voice, and the voice that she is communicating with is the voice of an angel. Dark matter is spirit and matter together, which is the same thing as angels. She learns that angels have intervened in human evolution for vengeance. In episode 5, we see Lord Boreal taking Mrs. Coulter to his very fancy house in Will's version of Oxford. There he peacocks about his vast collection, and Mrs. Coulter is very unimpressed. She really only perks up when Lord Boreal mentions that women in this world are quite arrogant, including Mary Malone, the scientist that Lyra has been speaking with. Mrs. Coulter is very, very curious about who this woman might be. She somehow convinces Lord Boreal that she will go to Mary Malone's office alone. So we have a very brief but absolutely amazing makeover scene where Mrs. Coulter holds her first pair of jeans, decides to don the strongest pantsuit of all time, and changes her hair a bit. It's really a moment when Mrs. Coulter decides that she can be a different kind of woman than the woman she has been. In addition to leaving Lord Boreal at home, she also leaves the Golden Monkey at home. It definitely takes strength, but doesn't seem to cause the harm or distress to Mrs. Coulter that it does for the Golden Monkey. Mrs. Coulter does go to meet Mary Malone. She hears all about Lyra from a different adult woman's perspective. Mary Malone is also very curious about Mrs. Coulter's academic history, any achievements she has. Feeling a bit intimidated by Mary, Mrs. Coulter bounces. We also see that Mary's cave has a message for Mary. It tells Mary that she is about to go on a journey. We see an image of a serpent on the cave's screen, and the cave tells Mary that her task is to save the girl and the boy, and not to worry, she will be protected. When she gets back to Lord Boreal's lair, Mrs. Coulter goes off about the patriarchy. I will discuss this in my next video, best moments of the season. While this is happening, back in Cittàgazze, the kids are devising a means to steal the alethiometer back without having to give up the knife. They decide that they're going to cut into Lord Boreal's house using the knife, creating a window between the worlds. Lyra is absolutely horrified to see her mom there. Boreal and Will eventually duke it out over the knife. Of course, Boreal is a grown-ass man, but Will is a boxer. He had boxing lessons, he knows how to fight, and eventually he is able to take hold of the knife once again. On the other side of the room, Mrs. Coulter and Lyra are struggling, and we see Pan, I think in badger form, attack the golden monkey very brutally. Lyra is very wrapped up in this, and Will eventually has to call for her several times to get her to come through the window. At the end of the episode, we also see Mary Malone head through the window in her Oxford into Cittàgazze to start her journey. In episode 6, the witches have made it through the anomaly into the world of Cittàgazze. They see angels flying in the sky. Ruta Skadi decides to join the angels because she knows that they are headed to war and to Asriel. Serafina remains to find Lyra. Angelica, Paola, and the other kids from Cittàgazze are super pissed that Tullio has been attacked by the specters without the presence of the knife. They decide that they are going to avenge Tullio by attacking Will and Lyra, so they make their way to the cafe where Will and Lyra have been living. Despite the fact that Will is very badly injured with his wound, Lyra recognizes the danger that they're in and manages to get him up onto the roof with them. Right in the nick of time, as the kids are scaling the walls and approaching Will and Lyra on top of the roof, Serafina Pekkala finds them and scares the kids away. Will is quite reluctant to share anything about the knife with the witches, but Lyra knows that she can trust the witches. She basically spills the beans about the knife. Serafina determines that because Will's wound was caused by magic, it must be healed by magic, and the witches are going to create a spell to heal the wound. I was delighted that we got to see the witches actually perform their spell, and luckily for Will, the spell seems to work in stopping the bleeding at least. When he's feeling a bit better, Serafina tells Will about the prophecy and reveals to him that yes, it is her job to look after him, but it is also his job to look after her. They are definitely each other's responsibility. Back in Lyra's world, Lee Scoresby and Jopari cross through the anomaly in the balloon and head into the world of Cittàgazze. The Magisterium is in hot pursuit though, and the Magisterium eventually catches up with their balloon. We see Jopari working his shaman magic. Unfortunately, as skillful as he is, it isn't quite enough. One of the Magisterium soldiers shoots the gas bag in the balloon. They go down, and we're not exactly sure how they're going to fare at this point. In Lyra's world, things are happening at the Magisterium. Fra Pavel is the alethiometrist of the Magisterium, and he tells Father MacPhail that he has some news from the alethiometer. As a result of that news, Father MacPhail announces that the Magisterium will be taking a new direction entirely, that sacrifices will be made, and the first person who will be making a great sacrifice will be Lyra Belacqua, Mrs. Coulter's daughter. It's clear that Fra Pavel has told Father MacPhail about the witch's prophecy. Mrs. Coulter and Lord Boreal are back in Cittàgazze. Mrs. Coulter has heard a bit about the specters and decides that she's very interested in them. She forces herself, while Lord Boreal literally cowers inside, to separate from her demon. She leaves him kind of hanging out in front of the cafe while she approaches the Tower of the Angels. She makes a decision. Something has switched in her mind, so that when the specters approach her, she is scared but resolute. And we see the specters kind of encircling her but not attacking her. She is kind of in command of these terrifying creatures. Mrs. Coulter celebrates her success by sharing a bottle of wine with Lord Boreal. When they reach the second bottle, she accidentally on purpose poisons him. And as they are discussing her wild success, Mrs. Coulter lets Lord Boreal know that he is no longer needed. It's funny that he ever thought they were equals because she is better than him in every way, and he would only hold her back. And then she spends the rest of the evening getting drunk next to his corpse, which is pretty morbid even for her, let's face it. In episode 7, we find out, surprise, surprise, Lee and Joffrey have survived their balloon crash. With that said, the Magisterium soldiers who are in hot pursuit have finally caught up with Lee and Joffrey, and they are not there to be friends. Lee and Joffrey eventually make a decision, realizing that one of them has to go on and one of them has to stay to keep the guards where they are. Lee knows that he is the one who has to stay, and bonus, he is a great shot, so he takes one for the team and stays to fight the Magisterium while Joffrey continues on his journey to find the knife bearer. He does a beautiful job keeping the Magisterium soldiers off for as long as possible as he is shot again and again and again by Magisterium guards until he finally knows that his time has come to an end. Lee uses a piece of Seraphina's cloud pine that she gave him to summon her for help, but unfortunately it's a bit too late and Lee and Hester die before Seraphina can get to them. And it's really fucking sad, to be honest. Not far away, Lyra and Will go back and forth repeatedly about whether they want to stay with the witches or whether they want to go on their own to pursue Will's dad. One of the witches who is accompanying Seraphina and the kids is split off from the group and heads to Cittàgazze to warn any adults who might still be there, and she ends up running into Mrs. Coulter. She doesn't know that Mrs. Coulter is who she is though, so she legitimately tries to warn her to get the fuck out of the city, but Mrs. Coulter has other plans. Using her frequent MO of torture, she eventually gets Lena, this witch, to tell her that the prophecy about Lyra is about the mother of all, Eve. Lyra is Eve. The fate of the world rests on whether Lyra will fall as Eve did so long ago. Of course, Mrs. Coulter decides that Lyra cannot fall and she will do whatever it takes to make sure that this calamity doesn't happen. We learn from Seraphina that this prophecy states that Lyra will bring about the end of destiny and also ensure that we have free will. Pretty important. Seraphina recognizes the summoning that Lee did with her cloud pine, and she splits off from the rest of the group, leaving one witch to supervise. Lyra and the witch fall asleep, and when they're sleeping, Will creeps off. We see him come near this shadowy hooded figure, which we recognize as Joffrey, and it doesn't take long before the two recognize that not only are they knife bearer and shaman guy, but they're also Will and John Perry. This father and son duo have finally met up after so many years of missing each other, and it's a complicated reunion. There are some hard feelings. As much as John wants to be there as Will's dad, he is very clear that Will has a task. He is tasked with bringing the knife to Azriel's side of the war. He will be using this knife to destroy the authority. If only they had all the time in the world to fix their relationship, that would be a different story. They don't. This is his dark materials, and shortly after John passes along this task to Will, one of the Magisterium soldiers finally catches up with John and shoots John as he is protecting Will. John goes down in Will's arms. It is tragic, and we see John Perry die. This is a deviation from the book. Not sure why they made it. Right before he dies, John does tell Will that the evening is full of angels and they will guide him. Very conveniently for her, Mrs. Coulter finds Lyra asleep with Will gone, and she takes her opportunity. Mrs. Coulter decides to keep Lyra asleep in a steamer trunk. Ostensibly, she is taking her someplace safe. Who keeps their kid drugged in a steamer trunk? No one great. The episode ends with a call to arms from Azriel. Eventually, we do see angels come forth joining his side of the war. Unbeknownst to me the first time around, there is a super secret ending to this episode, which one of you kind YouTube folk told me about. After the credits, there is a bonus scene of Roger calling out to Lyra to help him. He is pale, ghostly even, and we know that Lyra and Roger's friendship has not ended. Something else is in store. If you've made it to the end, thank you so much for bearing with me through my recap of season 2. I hope you found it helpful. I had a great time rewatching the season, and honestly, I think I liked it more. I'm so excited to dive into season 3 next month. I cannot wait to talk with you, to read all of your amazing insights and comments, and just know that I appreciate you and I'm glad that we're back together.